In eastern Peru, the land descends gradually from the Andes into a wide basin of forest and water. The Amazon rainforest here is dense and continuous, stretching for hundreds of miles without clear boundaries. Rivers dominate the landscape. They are broad, slow-moving, and often the only reliable routes through the terrain. From above, the forest appears uniform. From within, it is layered and enclosed. December marks the beginning of the rainy season. Warm air rises from the forest floor, forming tall storm clouds by afternoon. Rain falls heavily and without warning. Visibility can change within minutes. The ground rarely dries. Leaf litter covers uneven soil, and fallen trees lie hidden beneath vines and undergrowth. Sound carries poorly. Distance is difficult to judge. Human settlements exist along the rivers, but they are sparse. Between them lie long stretches of uninhabited forest. Roads are rare. Aircraft are commonly used to connect remote towns to the rest of the country. For decades, small commercial flights have crossed this region, moving above the forest canopy and following river paths invisible from the air. At ground level, the environment offers little orientation. The canopy blocks the sun for much of the day. The forest repeats itself in every direction. Movement is slow and physically demanding. Water is abundant, but safe passage is not. Injuries are difficult to treat. Infection is common. Rescue, when needed, depends largely on chance and proximity. In this setting, isolation is not dramatic. It is ordinary. The forest does not signal danger. It simply continues, unchanged, regardless of who enters it or how they arrive. Juliane Koepke was born in Munich, Germany, in 1954. When she was a child, her parents relocated to Peru, where both were involved in scientific research. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepke, was a zoologist. Her mother, Maria Koepke, was an ornithologist. Much of their work focused on the wildlife of the Amazon basin, particularly birds. Their research required long stays in remote areas, often far from towns or infrastructure. Juliane spent much of her childhood in Peru. For several years, she lived with her parents at a biological research station deep in the rainforest, later known as Panguana. The station was isolated and accessible only by river or small aircraft. Life there followed a practical rhythm. Supplies were limited. Movement through the forest required care. Daily routines were shaped by weather, insects, and terrain rather than by schedules. Although Juliane was not trained as a survival specialist, she grew up observing how her parents navigated the forest environment. She learned basic principles through exposure rather than instruction. She understood that rivers could lead to people. She knew that standing water carried risks. She was familiar with insects, heat, and constant humidity. This knowledge was incomplete, but it was grounded in real experience. By December 1971, Juliane was 17 years old and attending school in Lima. She had traveled to the capital to spend time away from the research station and to continue her education. As the Christmas holidays approached, she and her mother planned to return to Pucallpa, a city in eastern Peru, before continuing on to their station. Commercial air travel was a routine part of movement in Peru at the time, especially for journeys between the coast and the Amazon region. Flights were often short and scheduled frequently. Weather disruptions were common during the rainy season, but delays were generally accepted as normal. On December 24, 1971, Juliane and her mother boarded LANSA Flight 508 in Lima. The flight was scheduled to cross the Andes and descend into the Amazon basin, landing in Pucallpa. It was meant to be a standard journey. They carried no special equipment and made no preparations beyond those of an ordinary passenger. For Juliane, the flight was simply a return to familiar ground. LANSA Flight 508 departed Lima on the morning of December 24, 1971. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-188A Electra, a turboprop plane commonly used on domestic routes in Peru. On board were passengers traveling for the holiday, along with a full crew. The flight path would take the plane eastward over the Andes before descending toward the lowlands of the Amazon basin. Weather conditions along the route were unstable. December storms were common in the region, and thunderclouds often formed rapidly over the forest. As the aircraft approached the eastern side of the Andes, the crew encountered increasing turbulence. Rain intensified. Visibility decreased. The plane entered a storm system marked by strong updrafts and electrical activity. At approximately 3,000 meters above the forest, the aircraft was struck by lightning. The impact was sudden. The structure of the plane failed in midair. The fuselage broke apart. The event was not survivable for most on board. Seats, luggage, and sections of the aircraft were torn away and scattered downward. Julianne Coep was seated near her mother when the breakup occurred. She was still strapped into her seat. What followed was not recorded by instruments or witnesses. The aircraft ceased to exist as a single structure. The fall that followed was uncontrolled and unobserved. Debris descended into the rainforest canopy below. The forest absorbed much of the impact. Tall trees intercepted falling objects before they reached the ground. The remains of the aircraft were dispersed across a wide area, hidden beneath dense vegetation. For Julianne, separation from the aircraft marked the end of all external support. There were no distress signals, no immediate rescue efforts directed at the exact location. The flight vanished from radar coverage. From this moment forward, survival depended on what remained after the fall and on what could be found within the forest itself. Julianne regained consciousness on the forest floor sometime after the fall. The exact duration of unconsciousness is unknown. When she awoke, daylight filtered unevenly through the canopy above. The air was warm and heavy. Rain fell intermittently. She was still strapped to her airplane seat, which lay tilted against vegetation and broken branches. Her injuries were significant. She had a fractured collarbone, a torn knee ligament, and multiple deep cuts. One of her eyes was swollen nearly shut. She was concussed and disoriented, but conscious. Her glasses were gone. One sandal remained on her foot, the other was missing. Around her, there were no clear signs of other survivors. Julianne freed herself from the seat and assessed what she had. She wore a sleeveless dress. In her possession were no tools, no food, and no first aid supplies. Nearby, she found a small bag of sweets that had fallen from the aircraft. These would become her only food for several days. The forest around her was dense and unfamiliar. Despite having lived in the Amazon region for years, she did not recognize this area. She did not attempt to remain at the crash site. Experience from her parents' work had taught her that remaining stationary in the jungle without shelter or signaling equipment reduced the chances of being found. She also knew that rivers were often used by local people and could lead to settlements. She began to walk. Movement was slow and painful. Her injuries limited her range of motion, and the uneven ground made balance difficult. She followed a small stream, moving downstream whenever possible. The water provided a consistent direction and reduced the effort required to push through vegetation. She drank directly from it, despite the risks, because dehydration was an immediate concern. Days passed without clear distinction. Rain fell daily. Insects were constant. Mosquitoes gathered around open wounds. Flies settled on exposed skin. Without the ability to clean or dress her injuries properly, infection began to develop. Maggots appeared in the deeper cuts, particularly on her arm. She did not attempt to remove them immediately, lacking the means to do so safely. Each day followed a similar pattern. She walked when she could. When exhaustion set in, she stopped and slept on the ground. At night, the forest sounds intensified. She did not attempt to build shelter. Her energy was focused on forward movement rather than protection. The sweets were consumed gradually, then ran out. Hunger became constant. She did not attempt to hunt or forage. She lacked the knowledge to identify safe plants and understood the danger of consuming unknown food. Water remained her only reliable resource. Despite pain and disorientation, Julianne maintained a simple rule: follow the water and keep moving. This decision structured her days. It reduced the number of choices she had to make and allowed her to conserve mental energy. The forest remained unchanged around her, but the river offered continuity. As her strength declined, progress slowed. Each step required effort. The distance covered each day was limited. Still, the river continued, and with it, the possibility of human presence somewhere ahead. As the days passed, Julianne's physical condition deteriorated. The injuries sustained in the fall did not improve. Swelling increased around her collarbone and knee. Movement became more painful and less stable. Each step along the riverbank required careful placement, and falls became more frequent as fatigue set in. Infection progressed in the open wounds. The humid environment prevented drying. Insects remained constant. The maggots in her arm wounds multiplied. While disturbing, their presence reduced the spread of deeper infection by consuming dead tissue. Julianne did not fully understand this at the time. She endured the discomfort without the ability to intervene. Her vision remained impaired. With one eye swollen and no glasses, depth perception was limited. Navigation became more difficult. The forest canopy blocked direct sunlight, making it hard to determine time or direction beyond the flow of the water. Days blurred together. Sleep came in short intervals, interrupted by rain or insects. Food was no longer available. Hunger weakened her further, slowing her pace and reducing concentration. She drank continuously from the stream to compensate for fluid loss, aware that untreated water carried risks but unable to avoid them. Diarrhea followed, compounding dehydration and fatigue. Psychological strain increased as physical strength declined. There were long stretches without any sign of human presence. No aircraft passed overhead. No voices carried through the forest. The assumption that rescue teams would search the area began to fade, though she did not know how long such efforts might continue. At one point, Julianne encountered a narrow area where the river cut through fallen trees and debris. Progress required wading through deeper water. This slowed her movement further and increased exposure to insects and aquatic hazards. Still, she continued downstream, maintaining the single rule she had established. Her mother was absent throughout this time. Julianne did not know her fate, though the absence itself suggested an answer. She did not dwell on it directly. Survival required attention to immediate conditions rather than reflection. Emotional responses were delayed or suppressed by necessity. Exhaustion accumulated. Each day demanded more effort than the last. The forest did not change, but Julianne did. Weight loss became visible. Coordination declined. The risk of collapse increased with every mile traveled. Yet the river widened gradually, a subtle indication of proximity to larger waterways. This change was slow and easy to miss, but it marked movement toward areas more likely to be traveled by people. Julianne continued forward without certainty, sustained only by routine and the assumption that movement was preferable to stopping. On the 10th day, Julianne noticed a change in the riverbank. The vegetation was less dense, and the ground showed signs of disturbance. Cut branches and cleared areas appeared intermittently along the water's edge. These were not natural formations. They indicated recent human activity. Soon after, she came upon a small shelter. Made of palm leaves and wooden poles. Nearby were containers, a canoe tied to the bank, and evidence of regular use. The camp was empty. Julianne did not know how long it had been abandoned or when someone might return. She remained there, too weak to continue walking. Inside the shelter, she found a small amount of fuel. Remembering her father's advice, she poured it over her infected wounds to kill the maggots. The pain was severe but brief. Afterward, she lay down and waited. The following day, local loggers returned to the camp. They found Julianne weak, injured, and barely able to speak. At first, they were uncertain how to respond. She was eventually taken by canoe downriver to a settlement, then transferred to a hospital. On January 3, 1972, 11 days after the crash, Julianne Coep was formally identified as the sole survivor of LANSA Flight 508. Julianne Coep was hospitalized in Pucallpa and later in Lima. Her injuries were treated, and the infections were brought under control. She remained in medical care for several weeks. Only after her recovery did the full scope of the disaster become clear. All other passengers and crew members from LANSA Flight 508 had died in the crash or shortly afterward. Among them was her mother. Search efforts had been conducted in the days following the disappearance of the aircraft, but the dense forest and the wide debris field limited their effectiveness. The remains of the plane were located later, scattered and largely inaccessible. Julianne's survival was confirmed after rescue teams and authorities compared passenger lists and hospital records. In the years that followed, Julianne returned to Germany and continued her education. She later became a biologist, specializing in mammalogy, and eventually returned to the Amazon region for research. Her work focused on understanding wildlife rather than on recounting her survival. She spoke about the crash publicly only when necessary, maintaining a measured and factual account of events. The incident remains one of the most documented examples of survival following a high-altitude aircraft breakup. It is notable not for dramatic action, but for endurance, basic decision-making, and familiarity with environment. Julianne Coep did not overcome the rainforest. She moved within it, following existing paths and relying on knowledge gained long before the event. The forest where the crash occurred has changed little since 1971. Rivers still serve as routes. Storms still form without warning. Flights continue to cross the region. The survival of one passenger did not alter these conditions. It remains a record of what is possible when chance, environment, and human response align, briefly and without ceremony.